Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Sonny believed with every fiber of his being that he had done everything humanly possible to protect Natalia from the merciless storm fast approaching Port Charles. In the quiet stillness of his home, he had handed her a new beginning wrapped in a set of keys, a fresh start in the safety of Belize. The gesture wasn't just symbolic. It was the manifestation of his faith, his redemption, and his need to shield at least one person from the growing shadow of chaos engulfing his world. With Marco standing as a silent witness, Sonny had no doubt he was doing the right thing. The look in his eyes was firm, resolute, almost triumphant, as if by saving Natalia, he could tip the scales of fate just slightly back in his favor. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that goodness, however small, could still triumph over the venom that seeped into every corner of Port Charles. But as the hours unfolded, his well-intentioned act transformed into the kind of devastating miscalculation that no amount of power, influence, or resolve could undo. Natalia never made it to Belize. She never even left the county. Unbeknownst to Sonny, mere minutes after stepping away from his protection, Natalia was intercepted by Sidwell's men, swift, efficient, and merciless. They did not offer explanations. They did not need to. She was property now, leverage in a war that was never about justice but about domination. Sidwell didn't need to draw blood to destroy Sonny, he needed to reach into the deepest part of him, tear it out, and dangle it like a prize. And who better than Natalia to play that role? She, the woman Sonny had just tried to rescue, the mother clinging to the hope of redemption for her son, was now a pawn. Not because she was weak, but because Sidwell had targeted what made her human, her love for Marco. Marco too had been ensnared, a prisoner not behind bars, but in a silent trap designed to force obedience through desperation. Sidwell's ultimatum was brutally simple: Natalia would kill Sonny, or she would be made to watch as Marco was destroyed piece by piece. What followed was the unraveling of everything Sonny thought he understood about loyalty, trust, and sacrifice. He spent the next day convincing himself he had done the right thing, that Natalia was on her way to safety, that he had outmaneuvered Sidwell. Meanwhile, in a dark, undisclosed location, Natalia stood trembling, holding a gun she never asked for, memorizing orders she never wanted to follow, while images of Marco, bound, beaten, barely conscious, were forced in front of her eyes. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. Sidwell wasn't negotiating, he was orchestrating a lesson. And Natalia was its executioner. Then came the storm. Rain lashed against the windows of Sonny's home that night, not with fury, but with quiet relentlessness. It was the kind of night that silenced the city, that made people pause and listen for sounds they could not explain. Sonny was alone, going over his plans, his mind still sharp despite the strain. When the knock came at the door, he felt no fear. Only relief. Natalia had returned. Perhaps she had forgotten something. Perhaps she simply wanted to say goodbye again. What he didn't see was the haunted look in her eyes, the way she didn't carry herself like someone who had just stepped into a new life. She looked lost, empty, as though she had already crossed over into a world from which she could never return. He welcomed her with open arms, warmth still radiating from his voice, his body language open, trusting. And that was his final mistake. Natalia didn't embrace him. She didn't speak. She simply stepped inside, water dripping from her coat, her eyes locked on his as if she were memorizing every detail for the last time. When her hand slipped beneath her coat and emerged with the cold black steel of a pistol, Sonny's smile faltered for the first time. Still, he didn't move. He didn't shout. Perhaps part of him already knew. Perhaps, deep down, he had always understood that in his world, no act of goodness went unpunished. Natalia's hands were shaking so violently the barrel of the gun danced in the dim light. Her tears flowed freely now, unchecked, cascading down her face like silent apologies. In her mind, she screamed every excuse she could think of, every memory that begged her to stop, every heartbeat of her son that she was trying to protect. But the seconds passed, and Sidwell was watching. She could feel his presence even if he wasn't there, could hear his voice reminding her of what would happen to Marco if she hesitated. In one final breath, Natalia mouthed words Sonny couldn't hear, though he felt them all the same, and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the hall like a death knell, and the world stood still. Sonny staggered back, his eyes never leaving hers, not with hatred or betrayal, but with heartbreaking confusion. He fell slowly, as if the weight of the moment dragged him down more than the bullet itself. Natalia dropped the gun almost before the echo had faded, collapsing to her knees, crawling toward the man who had once tried to save her. She pressed her hands against the wound, whispering broken apologies, begging him not to die, not because she wanted forgiveness, she knew she didn't deserve it, but because she needed to believe something could still be undone. But nothing could be undone. Sidwell had played his game perfectly. Sonny was down, perhaps dead, and Natalia had crossed a line from which there was no return. Somewhere far away, Marco remained captive, unaware that his mother had traded her soul to keep him breathing. And in Port Charles, as the storm howled louder, darkness began to settle in places even sunlight couldn't touch. Jason would come too late. Diane would rage at the system too broken to fix. And Willow, caught in her own illusion of a quickie Vegas wedding to a man crumbling under scandals of his own, would be the last to learn the truth, that everything was falling apart while she played pretend stability. Sidwell, of course, would celebrate in silence. His hands never touched a weapon. His face never appeared on any footage. And yet his fingerprints were everywhere, on the broken mother, the fallen kingpin, the shattered town. He had proven that fear, not bullets, was the true instrument of control. And now, with Sonny gone and his enemies scattering like ash in the wind, Sidwell's reign could truly begin. The war for Port Charles was no longer coming. It was here. And no one, absolutely no one, was safe. The gunshot shattered the illusion of safety that Sonny had so desperately tried to maintain in a world quickly unraveling around him. It was not just the sound of a bullet piercing flesh, but the brutal punctuation to a story built on trust, sacrifice, and misguided hope. The night, already heavy with the scent of rain and dread, fell into a stunned silence, as if time itself recoiled from what had just transpired. Sonny collapsed to the ground with a slow, disbelieving stagger, his body folding under the weight of betrayal more than the physical pain. His eyes, wide and hollow, searched for answers in the face of the woman he thought he had saved. There was no rage, no accusation in his gaze, only heartbreak, as he realized that the very trust he had placed in Natalia had been weaponized and turned back on him. It wasn't the bullet that struck the fatal blow, it was the irreversible fracture of everything he believed he had preserved. Natalia rushed to his side, the gun slipping from her trembling hand, forgotten the moment it fulfilled its cruel purpose. Blood stained her palms as she pressed them against the wound, whispering apologies that came out as broken breaths. Her sobs tore through the still air, mixing with the scent of iron and rain, but her grief could not undo the damage. Every frantic movement to stop the bleeding only emphasized the futility of her actions. This was never going to be a rescue. She had not returned as a daughter of mercy, but as a pawn of destruction, and now she was watching the man who had once believed in her slip through her fingers. The horror etched across her face was not just for Sonny's fading life, but for the realization that she had delivered Port Charles into the hands of a man who would use her moment of weakness to wage psychological war against an entire community. Sidwell had orchestrated this moment with surgical precision. His victory didn't require an army or an explosion, it required the collapse of a single man's belief in redemption. And in Sonny, he found the perfect target. The man who once controlled entire empires now lay broken on his own floor, undone not by his enemies in the legal system or by the violent streets he'd long conquered, but by love, by trust, by the belief that he could still save someone. Somewhere in a darkened room, Marco sat chained, bruised, and blindfolded, unaware that his mother had committed an unspeakable act in a futile attempt to save him. And in another part of the city, in the shadows of halls built to uphold justice, Sidwell smiled in quiet triumph. He knew that the real devastation was not measured in lives lost, but in the decay of trust, the poisoning of hearts, the unraveling of identity. His war was not one of territory, but of morality, and he had just claimed one of his greatest victories. At the Port Charles Police Department, the scent of ink and stale coffee lingered in the air as Justine prepared a warrant she believed would change everything. Her hands moved swiftly over files and affidavits, fully committed to the image of Sonny as the center of a criminal web she had long sought to dismantle. She imagined the click of handcuffs, the gavel of a courtroom, the headlines screaming justice. But what she didn't know, what no legal document could foresee, was that Sonny had already been brought to his knees, not by law, but by betrayal. The warrant would never reach its target. Justice, at least in its intended form, had once again arrived too late. In her pursuit of order, Justine had unknowingly become a shadow figure in a larger, crueler narrative that had already devoured its protagonist. Jason, learning of the shooting in fragments, radio calls, half-formed sentences, whispers from terrified insiders, felt something inside him fracture. This wasn't just another hit, another territory dispute gone wrong. This was different. This was personal in a way that ripped open scars he thought had long since faded. Standing at the edge of a new war, Jason realized with chilling clarity that the battle he was about to face wasn't just about vengeance or even protection. It was about soul salvage. Port Charles, his home and battleground, was slipping into moral decay, and the man who had once anchored its criminal code with something resembling honor had just been destroyed from within. Jason now understood that he was not just fighting for Sonny, but for the last remaining threads of a community teetering on the edge of collapse. Diane sat in her office, the weight of the day pressing against her like a storm she could no longer outrun. She had been through battles before, messy divorces, criminal accusations, near-death escapes, but this was different. The rules no longer applied. The courtroom felt like theater, the law nothing more than a stage prop while real power played its games in the shadows. With each new revelation, each twist in the narrative, Diane began to question whether the principles she had fought to uphold still had any meaning. Could integrity survive in a world where trust was currency and betrayal its most potent weapon? She feared not. As the walls of the justice system crumbled around her, she began to wonder if there was anything left worth defending. And then there was Willow, seemingly worlds away, yet tethered to the same tragedy unfolding back home. Dressed in hurried elegance, lost in the fantasy of becoming a bride, she stood beside Drew, clinging to the illusion of control. Their rushed Vegas wedding, meant to be a strategy, a legal chess move, now looked more like a blindfold. She did not yet know that even as she whispered her vows, a much darker union had been forged in blood back in Port Charles. The words, "I do," barely left her lips before the world she thought she was manipulating began to twist into something unrecognizable. She believed she was making a move to reclaim custody, to build a future on carefully chosen foundations. What she didn't realize was that the very ground beneath her had already begun to splinter. The shot that ended Sonny's reign was more than the fall of a man, it was the unraveling of a legacy, the beginning of a power vacuum that would not remain empty for long. Sidwell had struck precisely where it hurt most, and the ripple effects would be catastrophic. With Sonny down, Jason enraged, Diane disillusioned, and Willow blinded by ambition, Port Charles stood exposed. And in the silence that followed the gunshot, in the stillness between gasps and heartbeats, a new chapter had already begun, one written not with justice or redemption, but with shadows, betrayal, and the quiet laughter of a man who knew he had just changed everything. Natalia stumbled away from the scene like a phantom cast out from the living world, her mind a storm of fragmented thoughts, her soul hollowed by the magnitude of what she had just done. The cold night air clawed at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her feet carried her down the darkened, empty streets of Port Charles without direction, without purpose, only away. Away from the blood, away from Sonny's wide, shattered eyes, away from the broken pieces of herself that now littered the floor of the man's home she had just destroyed. She had committed the unthinkable, not merely by pulling a trigger, but by betraying the one person who had believed in her, the only one who had offered her a chance at salvation. And as she drifted through the shadows of the city, her heart throbbed not with regret alone, but with the knowledge that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. What she had paid was not just a toll of blood, it was the irrevocable forfeit of her soul. The silence around her mocked her inner screams. Streetlights flickered overhead like indifferent sentinels, casting long shadows that seemed to echo her isolation. She had no destination. No shelter. No forgiveness. Only questions that clawed at her sanity. Was Marco still alive? Had her act of betrayal been enough to spare him, or had Sidwell already claimed him as another casualty in his brutal game? The thought gripped her tighter than any chain ever could. Her son, her reason for everything, was now the final judge of her actions. If he survived, would he understand? Would he ever be able to look at her without seeing the blood she had spilled? Or worse, would he learn of what she had done and turn his back forever, leaving her truly alone in the world she had sacrificed everything to navigate? And Sonny, if he survived the bullet, could he survive the betrayal? Could a man so rooted in instincts of protection, power, and control ever again open his heart to anyone? Natalia had not only pulled a trigger, she had torn apart the very foundation of his identity. She had shown him that no matter how strong or strategic he was, no amount of foresight or planning could shield him from treachery if it wore the mask of love. If his body endured, what of his trust? His purpose? Would he rise again, fueled by vengeance, or crumble beneath the weight of disillusionment? And what of Sidwell, the architect of this entire nightmare, whose fingerprints would never grace a crime scene but whose evil coursed through every outcome? He had never needed to dirty his hands. His victories came from manipulation, from coercion, from exploiting the deepest vulnerabilities of his enemies. While the city slept, oblivious to the horror festering at its core, Sidwell plotted his next move. A man like him did not stop at one conquest. He did not simply wound, he infected. His poison spread silently, twisting alliances, corrupting morals, turning virtue into weakness. And now, with Sonny bleeding and Natalia unraveling, Sidwell stood on the precipice of true dominion over a city once ruled by men of code, even if those codes were criminal in nature. Now, there was only chaos. Port Charles had always danced on the edge of ruin, but this time felt different. This time, it wasn't just the fall of a man or the shattering of a family. It was the slow death of hope itself. Sidwell had proven that kindness could be weaponized, that faith was a liability, that even love could become the sharpest blade in the hands of a master manipulator. The people of this city didn't know it yet, but the rules of their world had been rewritten. What was once unthinkable had now become precedent. And in this twisted new reality, the lines between protector and predator, between justice and vengeance, had blurred beyond recognition. Was there anyone left strong enough to challenge that narrative? Anyone brave, or foolish, enough to confront the machinery Sidwell had put in motion? Could Jason rally a force of will to rise against this darkness, or would he too be consumed by the tidal wave of blood and betrayal? Could Diane, exhausted and outnumbered, still cling to the law in a world where justice had no teeth? Could Willow, still blinded by ambition and illusions of control, awaken before her choices entwined her fate with Sidwell's design? And what of Natalia? Was she doomed to wander the margins of this world she had helped destroy, or was there still some path, however narrow, that could lead her back from the abyss? These questions loomed like storm clouds over the city, and there were no clear answers. Only uncertainty. Only dread. What had happened was not a conclusion but an opening act. A prelude to something far worse. Port Charles had been cracked open, its foundation weakened by one man's cruelty and another woman's desperation. What rose from the rubble would not be built on justice or truth, but on secrets, sorrow, and blood. The war had only just begun, and every soul in its path would be forced to choose, surrender to the chaos, or risk everything to resist it. And so Natalia continued to walk, swallowed by the darkness, every step echoing the silence left behind. A mother without a son. A woman without a future. A sinner without forgiveness. And somewhere, far beyond her reach, the city she had helped break moved closer to its reckoning. As dawn approached and the first light crept over the city skyline, Port Charles remained cloaked in an uneasy quiet, as if the very streets were holding their breath. Natalia, still wandering like a ghost through the lifeless avenues, felt the weight of every decision crushing down on her chest. Her shoes soaked, her coat clinging to her skin, her hands stained with blood that no rain could wash clean. She was no longer the woman who had pleaded for her son's future. She was no longer anything. Somewhere behind her, a trail of grief had been carved into the world, a scar that no amount of time would ever fully heal. And yet, even in the ashes of everything that had collapsed, trust, family, legacy, there was the faintest flicker of something more. Not hope, not yet. But consequence. Because in Port Charles, nothing ever ends without awakening something else. Jason would not let the blood of his brother soak into the ground without retribution. Diane would not stand by while truth was mutilated in the name of control. And Sonny, if he lived, would rise not as the man he once was, but as something far more dangerous, a man stripped of illusions, forged in betrayal, with nothing left to lose. Sidwell believed he had won.